The blade went in just below his ribs, gentle and precise, like she was still being careful with him even now. Kale stood in his wedding clothes in the center of the bridal chamber, candles burning warm around him. White flower petals from the ceremony still scattered across the floor beneath his feet. He looked down at the dark stains spreading across his navy coat with confusion rather than pain. Isolde stood in front of him in her wedding gown, the dagger still in her hand. Her pale lavender eyes were calm in a way that didn't match anything that had just happened. She wasn't crying, wasn't shaking, looked instead like a woman finishing a task she'd waited a long time to finish. He asked her why, his voice coming out smaller than he meant it to. She told him gently that he had never been the one she wanted, only the one who was convenient. His legs gave out before he could respond to that. He hit the floor among the same white petals thrown at his feet during the ceremony hours earlier. The last thing he saw was Isolde kneeling beside him, adjusting the angle of his fall. His final thought wasn't about the dagger or her calm voice, but about his father downstairs still smiling at the reception. And then there was nothing at all. 3 months before that night, Kale Varanthe had been considered the most fortunate young man in the entire province. He was the only heir to House Varanthe, one of the wealthiest merchant families on the continent. He had spent his whole life being exactly the kind of son his father hoped he'd become. Generous without being foolish, ambitious without being cruel. The kind of man who remembered the names of every servant in his household. He had fallen for Isolde Thornfield the way people fall for things arranged to be irresistible. Gradually, then completely, never once suspecting the entire experience had been built for him. He proposed within 4 months of meeting her, and his father wept with happiness at the news. The wedding was planned to be the social event of the entire season. He spent the weeks leading up to it distracted and grateful, completely unaware of what was coming. He never suspected Isolde's mother had selected him specifically for his fortune and his trusting nature. He never suspected the entire courtship had been a transaction he didn't know he was part of. By the time the dagger found his ribs, he had spent 4 months being genuinely, completely happy. Which made the fall, when it came, land with the full weight of everything he hadn't seen coming. The darkness after death didn't stay dark for very long. Kale became aware of cold stone beneath him before he became aware of anything else. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't lying in his own blood anymore. He stood instead in a vast, dim space with no visible walls or ceiling. A faint crimson glow seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In front of him stood a figure unlike anything he had ever seen. Tall, draped in robes of black and deep crimson that moved like smoke despite the still air. Its eyes were pure black except for a single point of crimson light at the center of each. It held an ornate black staff topped with a glowing crimson orb. It looked at Kale with an expression impossible to read, ancient beyond any frame of reference. The being told him, without emotion, that he was dead. It said the wound had been precise, the blood loss fast, and that most stories simply ended here. Kale asked why his hadn't. The being studied him for a long moment, the crimson light flickering slightly at the center of its eyes. It explained that some deaths disturbed something fundamental about the balance it was meant to maintain. His death, it said, killed by someone who built an entire false life just to use and discard him, was exactly that kind of disturbance. It offered him a return, not a simple resurrection, but a reincarnation backward through his own timeline. 3 months earlier, to the day before Isolde Thornfield first appeared in his life. He would carry the memory of everything that happened to him. He would also carry something else, a fragment of its own authority, a power tied to endings. It warned him the power came with weight he wouldn't understand until he used it. Wielding something tied to endings meant he could never again pretend consequences were optional. Kale didn't ask what the cost would specifically be. He didn't weep with relief or celebrate the chance at a life that had just been violently stolen from him. He simply asked when he could begin. The crimson light expanded outward, and something settled permanently into his chest. Not warm, not painful, just permanent, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting his whole life to turn. He woke up in his own bed, in his own house, exactly as he'd been 3 months before the wedding. The same morning light fell through the same window. The same quiet sounds of the household drifted up from below. He lay still for several minutes before moving, running through everything he now carried. The dagger, the calm in Isolde's voice, the practical way she'd arranged his fall. Her mother's name spoken with an emphasis that suggested she'd orchestrated far more than anyone knew. He didn't feel rage, only something closer to clarity. The settled clarity of a man handed the answer key to a test he hadn't known he was about to fail. He got out of bed and washed his face, looking at his own reflection for a long time. He was 24 years old again, with 3 months standing between him and a dagger he now knew was coming. He understood immediately that the version of himself who walked into that wedding unaware was a version he had no intention of repeating. He decided he wasn't going to confront Isolde or expose her immediately. He wasn't going to do any of the loud, satisfying things his anger might have wanted. He was going to do something colder and far more useful. He was going to watch her build the entire structure of her plan a second time, in perfect detail, while she believed nothing had changed. The first person Cale found was Elira, Isolde's quiet, watchful handmaiden. A young woman who had spent the previous timeline standing several steps behind Isolde, saying nothing, noticing everything. In that timeline, Elira had known exactly what was being planned. She had said nothing, out of the particular powerlessness of servants who understand speaking up tends to end badly for the servant rather than the family. This time, Cale found her alone in the Thornfield garden 3 weeks before the wedding arrangements even began. He asked her quietly, with no accusation in his voice, whether she'd ever wondered what kind of man would be foolish enough to die for love in that house. Elira went very still. He told her he wasn't asking her to betray anyone or do anything dangerous. He only wanted her to remember things clearly, every detail, every small inconsistency that didn't sit right. He told her one clear memory from one person paying attention would someday matter more than any accusation he could make himself. She asked, carefully, if he already knew something. He told her he knew enough to be patient, and that patience was the most dangerous thing he could offer anyone in that house. She didn't promise him anything out loud. But she also didn't walk away, and when he left the garden he understood he'd found exactly the kind of ally the situation required. Over the following weeks, Cale let the entire courtship play out exactly as it had before. The same dinners, the same long conversations, the same carefully engineered moments designed to look like fate rather than design. He let her believe she was succeeding completely. He proposed at the same garden party, in the same way, with the same ring. He watched her accept with the same practiced warmth that once convinced him he was the luckiest man alive. Now, with full knowledge of what was underneath it, he could see every seam in the performance. The half-second delay before her smile reached her eyes. The way her gratitude always circled, however lightly, back to mentions of his family's wealth. He said nothing about any of it. His father wept with happiness at the engagement dinner exactly as he had before. Cale sat through it with the discomfort of watching someone he loved be genuinely happy about something built entirely on lies he wasn't ready to expose. Lady Marguerite Thornfield attended every pre-wedding event with the same severe elegance Cale remembered. This time he watched her closely, noting how she assessed every room for its financial value. Her warmth toward him always carried the faint, calculating weight of someone pricing an asset. He quietly had his family's solicitor review the marriage contract Lady Marguerite had drafted. Not obviously, just a careful second reading framed as standard diligence. What the solicitor found was buried in language designed to be skimmed past rather than read closely. A clause stating that if Cale died within the first year of marriage, his entire estate would transfer directly to Isolde. No provision required any investigation into the circumstances of his death. Cale read the clause twice and felt the cold satisfaction of a man finding solid ground to stand on. He didn't act on the discovery right away. He understood that one clause, however damning, wasn't enough to bring down a family this practiced at covering its own tracks. He needed a pattern, not a single thread. So he started asking Elira small, careful questions whenever they crossed paths in the Thornfield household. Nothing direct, nothing that would put her at risk if anyone happened to be listening. He asked her once if Lady Marguerite had ever traveled anywhere unusual in the months before Isolde's courtship began. Elira thought about it for a long moment before answering. She said there had been a trip to a neighboring province, one Isolde herself had never been told the reason for. Cale filed that piece away carefully, the way he filed away everything else. He had his solicitor quietly request records of any notable engagements or marriages connected to that neighboring province. The records took almost 2 weeks to arrive, delayed by the kind of bureaucratic slowness that worked in his favor. When they finally came, one name stood out immediately. A young heir from a respected merchant family, engaged to a woman distantly related to Lady Marguerite's side. Dead 8 months earlier, the cause listed simply as a sudden illness. His estate had transferred cleanly to his grieving fiancée within weeks of his death. Cale read the report twice, his expression unreadable, his hands completely steady. It was the kind of detail that meant nothing on its own. Provinces were smaller than people liked to admit, and unfortunate deaths happened to perfectly ordinary families all the time. But Kale had learned, in his first life, exactly how dangerous it was to dismiss a coincidence simply because it was convenient to dismiss. He asked Elira to quietly find out whether anyone in the Thornfield household had ever mentioned that family's name. 3 days later, she came back with an answer that made the cold feeling in his chest settle into something firmer. Lady Marguerite had visited that family twice in the months before the young heir's death. Visits that had never been mentioned to anyone, including her own daughter, as far as Elira could tell. Kale asked her how she'd learned that detail without raising suspicion. She told him she'd simply asked an older servant who remembered everything and trusted almost no one but her. He thanked her, quietly, and told her she had just become more valuable to this than she probably realized. Isolde, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening around her. She moved through her engagement exactly as she had the first time, confident in a plan she didn't know was already being unraveled. She attended fittings for her wedding gown, each one more elaborate than the last. She wrote letters to distant relatives inviting them to witness what she described as the happiest match of the season. She practiced, in private, the specific warm tone she used whenever Kale's father was within earshot. She had learned long ago that a future mother-in-law's affection was worth cultivating just as carefully as a future husband's. She rehearsed small gestures of devotion the way an actor rehearses a role they intend to play for the rest of their life. None of it felt like deception to her anymore. She had done this enough times, in smaller ways, that the performance had become almost indistinguishable from a genuine self. She believed, in her own way, that she deserved the life this marriage would give her. She believed Kale's trust was simply the natural outcome of a man who had never had to be careful about anything. She did not believe, even for a moment, that the trust she was exploiting might already be a performance of his own. Lady Marguerite watched her daughter's progress with the satisfaction of a woman overseeing a project nearing completion. She had taught Isolde everything she knew, the same way her own mother had taught her decades earlier. She believed firmly that the world rewarded women who understood how to take what men were too careless to protect. She had survived her own difficult marriage by learning exactly when to be soft and exactly when to be precise. She saw nothing wrong in passing that same precision down to her only daughter. She reviewed the marriage contract one final time before it was due to be signed, checking every clause with practiced care. She did not know that a solicitor working quietly on Kale's behalf had already read every line twice. She believed, as she always had, that careful people made their own luck. She had no reason yet to suspect that luck, this time, had already shifted away from her without her noticing. Kale spent these weeks dividing his attention carefully between two completely different lives. In public, he was the same warm, easily delighted groom everyone remembered him being the first time. In private, he reviewed every report Elira brought him with the focus of a man building a case rather than nursing a grudge. He began keeping a private ledger of his own, separate from anything his solicitor maintained. Dates, names, small inconsistencies that meant nothing individually but added weight the longer the list grew. He noted the names of 2 other young men from prominent families who had died under circumstances no one had questioned closely. Both had been engaged, at the time of their deaths, to women connected somehow to House Thornfield. Both estates had transferred quickly and quietly, with no formal investigation requested by anyone involved. Kale understood now that he wasn't dealing with a single betrayal. He was dealing with a pattern that had likely been running for years, refined a little further with each repetition. He felt no satisfaction in confirming this, only the quiet, settled resolve of a man who finally understood the full size of what he was up against. He decided the plan could not simply end with exposing what had been done to him personally. It needed to end the entire pattern, completely, so no other unsuspecting man would ever again sit across a dinner table from Lady Marguerite Thornfield believing himself fortunate. He met with his solicitor late one evening, the study lit by a single steady lamp. He laid out everything he had gathered, the contract clause, the dead heir, Elira's careful information. His solicitor listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with every piece Kale added. When Kale finished, the solicitor asked him plainly what he intended to do with all of it. Kale told him he wanted it compiled, quietly and completely, into something that could be handed to the Crown's magistrate the moment it was needed. Not before the wedding, not as a way to stop it from happening. He wanted the wedding to proceed exactly as it had the first time, every detail identical, right up to the moment everything changed. His solicitor asked why he would risk walking into the same chamber, with the same dagger waiting, when he could simply end the engagement now and avoid the risk entirely. Kale was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that ending the engagement quietly would let Isolde and her mother simply move on to their next unsuspecting target. He said the only way to stop the pattern completely was to let it reach its final step, fully documented, with every piece of evidence already prepared and waiting. He said he wasn't afraid of the dagger this time, because the dagger was no longer the most powerful thing in that room. His solicitor studied him for a long moment, clearly unsettled by how calmly he said it, and then simply nodded and got back to work. News of the engagement spread quickly through the province, exactly as it had before. Invitations went out to every notable family within 100 miles. Mothers spoke of Isolde at every gathering as proof that grace and beauty could still secure the very best match available. Isolde accepted every compliment with the same practiced humility, the kind that made people love her even more for seeming not to want it. She gave a small toast at one of the early pre-wedding dinners that brought tears to half the room. Kale watched her deliver it with total conviction, understanding now just how skilled she truly was. Not simply at deception, but at the much harder skill of making deception feel like the most sincere thing in the room. Lady Marguerite stood near the edge of every gathering accepting praise for her daughter's match. Her composure was the satisfied stillness of a woman watching an investment mature exactly on schedule. Kale let all of it happen without interference. He smiled where he was meant to smile, said what he was meant to say, gave no one reason to suspect anything had changed. He understood that the higher Isolde was allowed to rise in everyone's estimation, the more complete her eventual fall would need to be. He found himself, more than once, having to remind himself that satisfaction was not the goal here. Justice, complete and quiet, was the only goal that mattered. A jeweler commissioned to appraise some of Isolde's wedding gifts mentioned something in passing to one of Kale's household staff. A very similar appraisal request had come through several months earlier from an entirely different household. A young man, now deceased, who had also been engaged to marry into a family connected to the Thornfields. Kale had his solicitor pull every record connected to that engagement immediately. It matched the pattern exactly: another quiet death, another clean transfer of inheritance. He added the name to his growing ledger without any visible reaction. Isolde began to notice small things shifting slightly out of alignment around the same time. A vendor who had confirmed a delivery suddenly couldn't recall the conversation at all. A finalized guest list somehow needed revisions twice within the same single week. None of it was dramatic, none of it traceable to any one clear source. She mentioned the strange feeling to her mother in a quiet, private moment. Lady Marguerite told her she was imagining things, that brides always felt anxious before a wedding this large. Isolde wanted to believe that completely, but the feeling refused to fully go away. She began watching Kale more closely than she had at any point in their engagement. Not quite suspicion, more the instinct of a careful predator double-checking a trap that has gone unusually quiet. She found nothing different in his behavior, nothing she could point to directly. That itself, somehow, made the unease worse rather than better. Kale noticed her watching him more closely and adjusted nothing about his own behavior in response. He understood that any visible change on his part now would only confirm whatever instinct was beginning to stir in her. He continued exactly as before, warm, attentive, utterly convincing, giving her nothing solid to hold on to. In the final week before the wedding, the household buzzed with the kind of activity only a major ceremony could create. Tailors made their final adjustments to Isolde's gown, the fabric so fine it seemed to catch light from nowhere. Kale's father walked through the manor twice a day simply admiring the decorations being assembled for the reception. Kale himself spent quiet evenings reviewing the final compiled file his solicitor had prepared. Every document, every testimony, every careful piece of the pattern laid out in clear, undeniable order. He read through it one final time the night before the wedding, alone in his study by lamplight. He felt no fear reading it, only the settled calm of a man who finally understood every variable in the room he was about to walk into. He closed the file, locked it carefully away, and went to bed early, the same way he had the very first time around. Tomorrow, the wedding would proceed exactly as it had before. And this time, he would be the only person in that bridal chamber who already knew how the night was supposed to end. The wedding day arrived exactly as it had the first time, bright and clear, with no sign of what waited at the end of it. Kale stood at the altar in the same dark navy formal coat with silver embroidery he remembered wearing before. 200 guests filled the grand hall of the Varanthe estate, every seat taken, every face turned toward the front. Isolde walked down the aisle in her elaborate white gown, silver blonde hair woven with small white flowers. She looked to everyone watching, like the happiest bride the province had seen in years. Kale's father stood near the front row with tears already gathering in his eyes before the ceremony even began. Lady Marguerite sat in the second row, composed and elegant, accepting quiet glances of admiration from those around her. The officiant began the ceremony with the same formal words Kale remembered from before. He found himself studying Isolde's face as she recited her vows, searching for any flicker of hesitation. There was none. Her performance was as flawless as it had always been. He spoke his own vows clearly, his voice steady, giving away nothing of what he carried inside him. When the ceremony ended, the hall erupted into applause, genuine and warm from every single guest present. The reception that followed filled the grand hall with music, laughter, and the particular joy reserved for occasions like this one. Kale's father gave a toast that made half the room cry, speaking about pride and love and the family his son was building. Lady Marguerite accepted congratulations near the edge of the hall with practiced warmth on her face. Kale watched her more closely than he ever had before, noticing the small, alert tension beneath her composure. She looked, to him now, like a woman managing a transaction that was almost, finally, complete. Isolde moved through the crowd accepting well wishes, her smile never faltering, her grace never slipping. Kale accepted congratulations beside her, playing the role of the radiant groom exactly as he had the first time. As the evening wore on, the music slowed, and guests began drifting towards smaller conversations near the edges of the hall. Kale's father approached him quietly during a lull and embraced him, telling him how proud he was of the man he'd become. Kale held the embrace a moment longer than necessary, knowing what this night still held in store. Eventually, the time came for the newly married couple to withdraw from the reception. The hall erupted into one final round of applause as they made their way toward the corridor leading to the private wing. Isolde's hand rested lightly in his as they walked, her expression composed, her pace unhurried. Kale felt the strange, settled calm of a man walking deliberately into a moment he had already survived once before. They reached the bridal chamber, the same room, the same candles already lit and waiting inside. White flower petals had been scattered across the floor exactly as they had been the first time. Isolde closed the door behind them, the sound of the reception fading into a soft, distant hum beyond the walls. She turned to face him, her wedding gown catching the warm candlelight around them. Kale watched her expression shift slightly, the practiced warmth settling into something more focused and deliberate. He knew exactly what was coming next, because he had already lived through it once before. Isolde's hand moved toward the fold of fabric at her side, where the dagger had been concealed since the ceremony began. Kale felt no fear watching her reach for it, only a quiet, focused readiness. She drew the blade slowly, the same motion he remembered from the night that had ended his first life. Candlelight caught the edge of the dagger as she stepped toward him. Her expression remained calm, almost gentle, the same unsettling calm he remembered from before. He let her take the first step toward him, exactly as he had decided he would. He let her raise the blade, exactly as it had happened the first time. And then, instead of letting the blade find his ribs again, Kale moved. His hand closed around her wrist before the dagger could complete its motion. Not violently, not even particularly fast, just completely, with a grip that left her nothing to fight against. Isolde's eyes widened, the calm in her expression shattering in an instant. The dagger hung motionless between them, caught in the space where it was supposed to have already finished its work. Kale held her wrist steady, his own expression calm in a way that mirrored the calm she had once shown him. He told her quietly that he knew exactly what she had planned to do, because she had already done it once before. Isolde's face drained of color as the words settled into her. She asked him, her voice no longer composed, what he meant by that. He told her that this was not the first time he had stood in this room, on this night, watching her raise that exact blade. He told her he had died here once already, and had been given the chance to return with full knowledge of everything she had planned. Isolde stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel trick. She found none, only the same unshakable calm he had carried through the entire evening. He told her that her mother's inheritance clause had already been quietly nullified weeks earlier through a separate legal filing. He told her that the records of the dead heir from the neighboring province had already been gathered and verified. He told her that Elira's careful memory of conversations she wasn't supposed to overhear had already been documented in full. He told her that all of it, every piece, was already sitting with the crown's magistrate, waiting only for the right moment to be presented. Isolde's hand went slack in his grip, the dagger slipping loose and falling among the white petals at their feet. She asked him, almost in a whisper, how long he had known. He told her he had known everything from the very beginning of this particular version of their engagement. He told her he had let her build the entire plan a second time, in perfect detail, simply so it could be properly documented and ended for good. Isolde took a step back from him, her wedding gown catching slightly on the fallen petals at her feet. She asked him why he hadn't simply ended the engagement quietly instead of letting things go this far. He told her that ending it quietly would have only allowed her and her mother to move on to their next unsuspecting target. He told her this was the only way to make sure the pattern stopped completely, not just for him, but for whoever might have come after him. Isolde said nothing for a long moment, the full weight of what was happening settling into her expression. Outside the chamber, the muffled sound of the reception continued, unaware of what was unfolding just beyond the door. Kale released her wrist slowly, no longer needing to hold on to it. She didn't reach for the dagger again, simply stood there, staring at the man she had believed, only moments earlier, she had already killed once before. He told her that the Crown's investigators would arrive at her family's estate within the next few days. He told her that her mother's arrest was already a certainty, regardless of anything either of them did tonight. Isolde asked, very quietly, what would happen to her specifically. He told her that there was no direct evidence she had ever held a blade in any of the prior cases connected to her mother's plan. He told her that for now, her own complicity would remain a private matter rather than a public one. Isolde's relief at hearing this was immediate and visible, though it didn't fully erase the fear still in her eyes. Kale watched her carefully, understanding that her relief came from believing she might still escape any real consequence. He said nothing yet to correct that belief, simply turned and walked toward the chamber door. He told her, before opening it, that the wedding night was over, and that she should remain in the chamber until morning. Isolde didn't move from where she stood, the dagger still lying among the white petals near her feet. Kale stepped out into the quiet corridor, closing the door gently behind him. He stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly, feeling the strange weight of having survived a night that had once ended his life completely. Down the hall, the sound of the reception continued, warm and unaware, exactly as it had the first time. He straightened his coat, composed his expression, and walked back toward the celebration as though nothing unusual had happened at all. 3 days after the wedding, Crown investigators arrived at the Thornfield estate just after sunrise. They came with a formal complaint already prepared, built from everything Kale's solicitor had quietly compiled over the past months. The complaint detailed not one suspicious death, but 3, each connected to a marriage contract drafted by Lady Marguerite's own hand. Each contract contained the same carefully buried clause guaranteeing inheritance without any requirement for investigation. Lady Marguerite was in her drawing room when the investigators arrived, reviewing correspondence as she did every morning. She looked up, mildly irritated at the interruption, before she fully understood who had entered the room. The lead investigator read the charges aloud in a calm, official voice that filled the elegant room completely. Household staff who had served her for years stood frozen near the doorway, watching in stunned silence. Lady Marguerite's composure held for the first few seconds, the same practiced stillness she had relied on her entire life. Then, for the first time anyone in that household had ever witnessed, her expression cracked. She demanded to know where this complaint had come from, who had dared to compile such accusations against her. The investigator told her simply that the evidence had been thorough, verified, and already reviewed by the magistrate's office. She was escorted from her own drawing room in front of the same staff who had once treated her every word as command. Word of the arrest spread through the province within hours, moving faster than anyone could have controlled. The story that had once been a fairy tale wedding became, almost overnight, the only thing anyone wanted to discuss. Invitations that had been promised to Isolde for upcoming gatherings quietly stopped arriving. Friends who had toasted her radiant happiness at the wedding found sudden, urgent reasons to be elsewhere whenever her name came up. Isolde herself was not arrested, since no direct evidence placed a blade in her own hand in any of the prior cases. The magistrate's office made the calculated decision to let her mother's prosecution unfold publicly while her own complicity remained private for now. But the social collapse around her was, in its own way, more complete than any prison sentence could have been. Mothers who had once held her up as an example to their daughters now crossed the street to avoid her entirely. The province's social circles, once so eager to celebrate her, now spoke her name only in lowered, scandalized voices. Isolde spent those first few days largely alone in her family's now quiet estate, the warmth that once surrounded her completely gone. She tried, at first, to maintain the same composed exterior she had always relied on, but there was no one left to perform it for. On the evening after her mother's arrest, she finally came to the Varanthe estate, asking to see Cale directly. He met her in the same garden where he had first found Elira weeks earlier, the same flowers blooming around them now in the fading evening light. Isolde's composure was gone entirely, replaced by something rawer and more uncertain than Cale had ever seen from her before. She asked him why he hadn't simply had her arrested alongside her mother, why he had let her keep her freedom while taking everything else from her. He told her, honestly, that prison would have given her a clean ending, the kind of resolution people could feel settled about. He told her he didn't want her to have that kind of ending. He wanted her to live the rest of her life inside the wreckage of everything she had helped build, fully aware of who had caused it to collapse. He told her no future marriage, no rebuilt fortune, no quiet relocation to another province would ever fully erase what the entire region now knew about her family's name. He told her this wasn't mercy, simply the most complete form of consequence he had available to give her. Isolde had no response to that, the silence between them stretching long in the cooling evening air. She turned eventually and walked out of the garden alone, her figure growing smaller as she crossed toward the estate gates. Cale watched her go without any particular satisfaction, because satisfaction had never actually been the point of any of this. He stood alone in the garden for a long while after she left, the same evening light filling the space that had once filled his bridal chamber the night he died. The power the crimson-eyed being had given him sat quietly in his chest now, the way it had since the moment of his return. It wasn't loud, wasn't demanding to be used again, just present, a fragment of something tied to endings that he understood he would carry for the rest of his life. He still didn't fully know its limits, and he suspected he never fully would. He had come to understand that this was simply the price of carrying something that powerful. You never get to map its edges completely, only to be careful with it. His father found him in the garden as the light began to fade, and didn't ask him anything directly. He simply stood beside his son for a while, the way fathers do when they sense something significant has happened without needing every detail explained. Cale told him, eventually, that the marriage to the Thornfields would not be moving forward, not now, not ever. His father nodded slowly, didn't ask why, and simply rested a hand on his son's shoulder the way he had done 100 times before. Cale looked up at the same darkening sky he had looked at 3 months earlier from inside an entirely different version of this exact evening. He felt, for the first time since his death and his strange return, something that wasn't cold calculation or quiet vigilance. He felt, simply, like a man who had finally been allowed to wake up. In the weeks that followed, Lady Marguerite's trial became the most closely watched legal proceeding the province had seen in a generation. Witness after witness came forward, many of them people Cale had never personally spoken to, each adding another piece to the pattern that had taken years to build. The dead heir from the neighboring province was named formally in the proceedings, his family finally given an answer they had waited 8 months to receive. 2 other families came forward once the case became public, each recognizing fragments of their own quiet losses in the pattern being described. Lady Marguerite was found guilty on every count brought against her, the verdict delivered without hesitation by the presiding magistrate. She was sentenced to spend the remainder of her life within the Crown's correctional estate, far from the social circles she had spent decades carefully cultivating. Isolde did not attend the sentencing, choosing instead to remain at the family estate that grew quieter and emptier with each passing week. She eventually left the province entirely, moving somewhere distant where her family's name carried no particular weight either way. Cale heard, much later, that she had taken a quiet position teaching needlework to children in a small coastal town, far from anything resembling the life she had once planned for herself. He felt nothing dramatic upon hearing this, only the same settled calm that had carried him through everything since his return. Elira remained in Cale's household after everything settled, no longer a quiet handmaiden in someone else's plan, but a trusted member of his own staff. She told him once, many months later, that she had never imagined the small things she'd noticed and remembered could matter as much as they ultimately did. He told her that paying attention, quietly and consistently, was often the most powerful thing anyone could do. Cale never remarried in haste again, taking his time in a way the version of himself from before would never have thought necessary. He carried the crimson light in his chest quietly for the rest of his life, using it rarely, and only when an ending truly needed to be final. He understood, by the time he was an old man looking back on everything that had happened, that the God who gave him that power had been right about one thing in particular. You never fully map the edges of something that powerful, You only learn, over time, to be careful with it. He had carried a fragment of authority over endings into a life that had once ended in his own blood on a wedding night he should never have survived. And he understood, finally, that the real power he had been given was never about ending anyone else's story. It had always been about making sure his own story no longer ended on someone else's terms.